Susan Schwartz is a certified emotional intelligence leadership and management coach with experience facilitating team building workshops for corporate and government clients focused on organizational change and digital transformation. She's a sought-after trainer on emotional intelligence, a speaker, and has instructed at renowned universities. Her publication, Creating a Greater Whole, a Project Manager's Guide to Becoming a Leader, was recognized by the Project Management World Journal as essential reading for global project leaders.
So yes, I'm a project manager. I arrange things. And what I learned, oh goodness, I won't say how many years ago, is that technology doesn't drive business, people do. And you need to be able to measure something if you want to promote behaviors. And that's why in the last few years, I've spent a lot of time, what I like to call a practical viewpoint of emotional intelligence. It's, you know, leadership skills are just not tangible. How do you measure empathy? How do you demonstrate, oh goodness, all of them. How do you measure and demonstrate positive confidence? You know, you kind of, it is what it is. When I used to teach technical people leadership classes, I'd always ask, you know, who are your greatest leaders that you admire? I had 30 people on the board. When I said, okay, what is it that made them a great leader? They would say, you know, I know when I see one. And they could not tell me any specifics. And a few years ago, the MHS research group went ahead and created a research project where they spoke with 1,700 top executives across North America, Canada, and the U.S. What they discovered was the top 21% all credited emotional intelligence to their success. So what about the other 79% of us? What is it that enabled those people? What made them so stellar in their fields that their customers, they closed business, they were able to create productivity, minimize costs, and increase performance. And a lot of it comes down to, is your team, is your organization engaged or disengaged? How easily do you engage with your customers? So my question in this slide here, in this picture, and please answer in chat, is this person walking towards you, or is this person walking away from you?
Away.
So away, okay. Anybody else? Why do you think they're walking away?
Based on the gesture.
I'm sorry, Sharon?
Based on the gesture. I analyze it. It's based on the gesture.
Oh, okay. Oh, based on the gesture? The shadow?
Yes.
What about the perspective? What happens if the sun is behind the person, you know, very forward in the picture, as opposed to behind us in the picture? How might that change your perspective? So it takes every organization, when you engage or disengage people, it's about the people, and everybody is different. So it's really, really hard when you look at that. And so when we look at emotional intelligence, this is a way of building relationships, engaging trust, and gaining insight. Now, all of this is really squishy. How do you build that relationship? We can go to networking events and shake hands, but have we really started a relationship? How do you build trust among your colleagues and among your client? And sometimes you really need to pay attention to see what's behind the curtain, what's really going on so that you can address that. And so by seeing these perspectives and really taking a look, it's not always what you see on the surface. And that's why when I think about emotional intelligence and using it as a tool, many people, and I respect these colleagues tremendously, many people will think about emotional intelligence as looking inward. And there is some of that, but when I think about emotional intelligence as a tool, it's a way of looking outward. It's a balance of observations and choices. So, when you pay attention, you really look at a situation, and this is the practical aspect. Evaluate your options. What information do you know? What do you know from experience? And what about different perspectives? When you speak with people or you look at it from different viewpoints, how will that adjust and change the action that you choose to take? Because you can't change anybody else's behavior but your own. And so when you're paying attention to the situation, you recognize where you're coming from, you identify where the people in your group are coming from your client's perspective. That's when you can choose the action to create a constructive outcome. You are in charge of how you react. You may not be able to choose the situation, but you can choose how you react. And right after I got certified in emotional intelligence, I was working in a workshop, and I mentioned I've spent most of my career in Washington, D.C. And most of the participants in my workshops were federal government subcontractors. And if you know anything about federal government subcontractors, and this was an IT subcontractor, is every day you have at least one crisis, if not two or three. And there was a gentleman who came to my workshop, and a few months later I saw him, and it had been a series of 6. And he said, "Your course was my favorite course." And I said, "Why? I'm not fishing, but could you tell me why?" And he said, "Well, I learned that people handle stress differently." And when I left the workshop, I was planning to fire my admin the next day. I was like, "Oh my gosh, what did she do?" And he said, "Well, she was a very good admin, but she just didn't get the urgency. She just didn't fit into the culture. She just didn't get it." He couldn't explain why. He said she just didn't get it. And what he did, because he learned that people handle stress differently, he went back and he thought, she was pretty good. If I fire her next Friday or this tomorrow, it's not going to be a big deal for the business. And he watched her. And what he saw was when he got this crisis call, he would slam down the phone, he'd yell, he'd wave his arms, he'd, react very strongly. He calmly went back to her desk, found the right person to handle it, and called them before he calmed down. Once he calmed down, he'd walk over, he'd bark, "Call Joe." Well, she'd already called Joe, and she was much too diplomatic to tell her boss that she'd already done it and that it wasn't just his idea. And what he realized was how valuable she was. He had no idea what she was doing and how quickly, what her efficiency was doing for the business. And so what he told me was, instead of firing her, I gave her a raise. It had an immediate impact on this man's business. He might have fired a really valuable employee, and it's strictly because he paid attention. No offense to all the consultants out there or me. He didn't have to hire somebody. All he did was pay attention. And that's where when I look at emotional intelligence, I really believe that it is about data, that you can measure all these activities. But remember, it's not about technology. Business is driven by people. And so what I'd like to do is take a moment and look at the people aspect when we take the 5 elements that are part of the emotional EQI 2.0 model and what it really means in your people behavior and interaction. The very first one is alignment. Officially, it's called self-perception. And that's how you view your role and how everybody else views theirs. It's almost like choosing your mission, knowing your direction. And then the next part is about communications. That's where you need to communicate your message so that it's received as you intend it. And that message is going to be different if you're talking to a board of directors, if you're talking to another department, another VP, or if you're speaking to people who report to you. And you need to change that message. And so you really need to think about that. How many of you can raise your hand, and how many of you have ever said, that's not what I meant? And people are overreacting, they're doing different things, and you're just going, if you'd only listen to me. Well, the key is they weren't listening to you because they weren't hearing your message. So how do you frame that? How do you shape that? And along those same lines becomes how you bring everybody together to execute that program. That's where you bring in the collaboration. When you have a really complex situation, how do you gather people to work together? And so that's really the third people element. And it is all about the people. And they also, everybody handles stress differently, correct? And some people, bad things just happen. It's nobody's fault. Remember, I'm a project manager. I'm into risk management and thinking about everything that can go wrong. And I prepare for it. And because I prepared for it, it doesn't happen. Sometimes bad things just happen. The day before I cut over a 5,000 person integrated voice and data system, we discovered the client had miscounted the telephones. And all of a sudden, we used up all our extra capacity. What do? You can't blame people, but you do need to think clearly and logically. And the key when you're the leader is everybody looks to you to see how you're going to react. And they will mirror your behavior. So if you're freaking out, they're going to freak out. And, it's a dirty little secret that we don't tell anybody. We are making it up as we go along, right? When those bad, unexpected things happen, you may be freaking out inside. You're trying to maintain calm. And you also need to know when you start to make assignments, you start to delegate, you start to say, Mary, you need to, look at this option. Dale, look at this option. Frank, look over here. You also need to know how they're going to be reacting as you make that assignment. And then when the ship rights itself, that's where decision-making comes in. And knowing how people make decisions or really like the practical viewpoint. Like for me, I love collaborative brainstorming decision-making. I want flip charts and sticky notes and colored markers. My husband's an engineer. He likes to logically think through every situation. And so his idea of decision-making in a crisis, and he deals in public utilities. So again, if they make a mistake, people die. It's really important that you stay calm. And so what he does is his team of, problem solvers will each think about it, come up with 2 or 3 solutions, and then they come back together in a room and they discuss it very calmly. Now, one way is not better than the other way. It just depends on the situation and the people involved. When I'm brainstorming and doing flip charts, I was a product manager. I had to think creatively. I had to figure out how to make that work. So you don't always, I'm going to talk about an architect. Do you want an architect throwing flip charts and sticky notes, or do you want that person making a rational, well thought out decision? So it's going to depend on the situation, the people involved. So while we're talking about the people, if I can pull us back together, because it's not, I talked about the 5 levels because it's sequential, but you're all going to blend them together when you really start to practice and take some of these practical steps into your workplace, and even sometimes your personal world, not only your workplace. So some of these emotionally intelligent prompts, I write blogs for emotionally intelligent leaders. I love that term. So one of these, when you're in a meeting, are you thinking about what you want to achieve? You're a salesperson. You got to make quota in 2 weeks or you might be fired. So are you thinking about how do you get this person to sign the bottom line? Or are you thinking what that client or your internal team needs to achieve? If you're focusing on your client, believe me, you're going to have a better chance of closing that business. But it's that me versus we type of mindset. And that's why when I talk about emotional intelligence, it's really an external. You're looking external at people. You need to know how you're going to react. You do need to look at yourself, but you've got to include those external people. Another prompt I enjoy, do you listen for the real story and ask questions? Or do you only hear what people are telling you? Think about that. Again, when a crisis happens and everybody's worried about somebody blaming them, are they only going to tell you what you need, what they think you should know so they don't get in trouble? Or do you listen and ask probing questions to get to the real issue so that you can resolve it more quickly? A third prompt, do you make decisions for people or with them? You might need to get buy-in to have several different department heads implement what you want to do. And if they haven't bought into it, if they feel you're just talking at them, you're telling them what to do as opposed to making them part of the solution, they could choose not to help you out. They could choose to sabotage your effort. So that's why it's so important to think about, is the situation where you're making decisions with them or for them? Sometimes, and in the business world, you feel like you're in the middle of battle. And you do need to be that general who's barking orders because it is a crisis. But if it's planning, if you're creating a plan, maybe you need to step back and listen to other people's perspectives and include them in that decision-making process. Let's pause. Does anybody have any questions? Let's try to apply this. I know I've sort of been doing what ifs all along. How many of you have to have difficult conversations every day? What makes a difficult conversation? Going to put it into chat or raise your hand. No takers. A difficult conversation is one of those where it's very possible that it will have a negative outcome. Because when you're thinking about it, the initial thought is that it's a win-lose situation. You're going to go into, and I call it a negotiation, but you're going to go into share resources. You're going to go in where you need to get more time, or you need to borrow somebody from a business partnership. Whatever you need, people are nervous about going in because it appears at the beginning to be win-lose. So if you want this conversation to come out in a positive, constructive outcome, I like to think about 3 steps. And the first is, what is the purpose of the conversation? What truly is that conversation that you want to have? And that's where you're thinking about, what is your role? How do you perceive yourself? What is the message? And how do you want to deliver it to get them working with you and not against you? So the next step, very logical, very reasonable, is to identify all those items that you want to happen. And then prioritize them, because if you list 8 items, you might only get 3. What are those top 3 that you want to make sure you walk away with? If you get 4 or 5, that's bonus. But what are the 3 that you're going to go to the mat for? And then the next part, that intangible empathy part, many people will go back and they'll think about, well, Barbara, she's going to want to get X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden, you're at loggerheads because to get what you need, Barbara's not going to get X, Y, and Z. It's that win-lose. What happens if you go into that conversation with, what are the fears and threats that Barbara needs to protect? So if you go in thinking, about what are their needs, what does Barbara, what is, her motivation? And you may not be able to totally know the exact motivation, but you can think about it. And so as you're thinking about what Barbara's afraid of losing, you can prepare your proposal. And you can try to make sure that you address, if Barbara's afraid of losing budget, how do you assure her that it's not going to affect budget? Whatever she helps you with will not impact the budget the next fiscal year. And so what you're doing by shifting and reframing that conversation is you're going into this with a win-win collaborative approach. You do want to get those 3 things that you want, but you also know, or are hoping to have thought about, what Barbara doesn't want. And that's a different conversation. Is that helpful when you start to think about emotional intelligence and those 5 steps? And you may not use all 5 in every conversation. And I want to make sure we have time at the end to get into the data. So, if you have a question, we can stop, or we can start to move into the data, the real measurement aspect of this.
Raj, I saw you had your hand up earlier. You had a question or a comment at this point?
Yes, Bill, I have a question. So thanks a lot. Going back to the difficult conversation, Susan, let's say you're having a difficult conversation regarding performance with an employee, or you need to fire an employee. These are not, how do you can't just get to a middle ground necessarily. How do you, with empathy, manage the situation? Because someone is not performing, for example, you're not firing him or her, but how do you manage it?
That is an excellent question, but I'm just trying to think through it. I think when you're having that conversation, there needs to, when that is the purpose of firing them, but also what is it about their performance that is not achieving the goals of their role? What is it about the role and the, I want to say the job tasks? You know, when you have you go out to the job description. What is it about their job description that they're not performing? And so if the purpose of whether it's a performance review, and hopefully before you fire them, you've had a performance review where you've let them know that they're not performing well. So if you can make a list of what their job functions are, and then which of those job functions they're not performing. When you get to the priority level, they're not going to be able to make changes overnight. So what is the most important skill, or what is the most important task that you need them to perform? And so you start with individual steps, and then they may need training. You may want to pair them with somebody. I know I've been in a situation where I didn't understand what the person wanted, and they never told me. They thought they had. They thought in that quick 5-minute, I need you to do this. But I didn't really understand, and I was afraid, and they were so busy, I didn't want to. And so if you can, set your expectations so they understand your expectation. And what you might find is once you've prioritized that, that's what their fears are. Of course, you don't want to lose your livelihood, but at the same token, what is it? What is their skill set? Or as you're thinking about what aren't they really performing, then you can look to it as what do they need? What can you do to support them? And obviously, if after you've gone through that education and guidance, they're still not performing, then you have a little, they're all difficult, but they understand walking into that you set their expectation, you set your expectation, and they're not meeting that expectation. Is that helpful, Raj?
Yeah, I think what you're saying fundamentally is get down to the data, be objective, just talk about what is required and where the performance does not meet. I agree with all that. I also think that one more thing that I've been utilizing is trying to understand their perspective of their performance, right?
Exactly.
And have them tell their story before telling yours. So yeah, thanks for that.
Oh my gosh. Oh, and thank you, Raj. That is absolutely HR 101. Listen to, are they happy or not unhappy? I've had 2 people that I've had to let go, and what I realized is they weren't happy either. They kind of needed permission. There were a couple of reasons, but I think that is excellent. Before starting that difficult conversation, now, this is where when you talk about what are they afraid of, you're getting their perspective. You're recognizing what is their purpose that they need to achieve. So Raj, thank you for reminding me of that. Any other questions? You want to get to the data? Or Bill is shaking his head. So part of the EQI 2.0 model that I use has 15 traits. And I'm very quickly going to review them, and then I'm going to show you some graphs of real people and real situations and how it impacts the performance of this business situation. So the first set of traits is that alignment. This is officially called self-perception. And what it's made up of three areas would be your confidence in your ability to do the job, your self-awareness that goes back to how you view yourself and how the world views you. Other people may view your role differently. Very much back to Raj's point, somebody might review why they were brought into the company differently than how you thought they were brought into the company. And then self-actualization is your professional growth. And how open are you to your professional growth? And when I wrote my book about managers becoming leaders, the best part was I interviewed all of the people who I considered great leaders who I aspired to be like. And one of my favorite leaders, I won't go into the whole story, but he was the CTO of our local power company. And when I spoke with him and I asked him, what is the one thing that you would tell new managers? He said, never stop learning. That was his advice. And that's where self-actualization is so very important. The next area is self-expression. That's communication related. As a leader, do you encourage other opinions? Do you reach out to encourage those other opinions? When you're speaking with other people, how authentic are you speaking in your voice that people can understand? I mentioned adjusting your message depending who you're speaking with. And this is also where making sure that you're walking the talk. Have you ever worked with someone, for someone who talked a big story and they said, do as I say, not as I do? How well did you respect them? How much did you want to work with them? Or did you move on as soon as you could? And then when we get to independence, a lot of that has to do with how you make decisions and the confidence in your abilities to not only make that decision, but to speak with other people to make that decision together, get them to have buy-in. The interpersonal, this is where we get into empathy and how you provide the attention that each person needs. You are very busy. You don't have a lot of time to do this, but you have moments where you can. If we have time, I'll tell you another story. Social responsibility, that comes back. That's really focused on your business community within your office. And that's cooperation, really pulling, how do you get that team working together and assuring cooperations? And then, of course, there's the relationships aspect with how do you build trust and rapport. And I do believe you'll get copies of this afterwards. Stress management, that we talked about resilience. How flexible are you to explore alternatives? And we go back to optimism, which links up with self-actualization about a growth mindset. Just because it's never been done before doesn't mean we can't do it. And then the fifth level here is the decision making. Problem solving, how well do you collaborate with people? I love that Apollo 13 story where they had to get the rocket back to Earth and they got in a room with everything that was on board, and it wasn't one person figuring it out, it was a collaborative effort because it took different perspectives, different viewpoints to look at things and play with them and make it all work. And then we get into reality testing. Oops, pardon me. When we're looking at reality testing, that's where you confirm your perception. That you really need to recognize what's going on. Part of that, listening to what probing, asking those important questions to find out what's really going on and not just what your team thinks you want to hear. And then impulse control is impulse control. Are you making rash decisions? Are you not? I mentioned I was a product manager at one point. It was for a startup. I had 90 days to build a product. It was a technology training company. It was a training course. And then I had 90 days to get a profit. So I had to know my customer really, really well. So that was my reality testing. I needed to know that we were making a product, that it was the right size, I could get it made and out the door, and that there were people who wanted to buy it. So at that point in my career, I had very little impulse control. I needed to think out of the box and creatively throw something against the wall. If it didn't balance with my reality testing, that very second slide that talked about the balance between behaviors and choices. But my products, I usually came in within 10% over under. It was very, very small number. And so that's where, just because you show up as having low impulse control, your role at that moment may not require it. I'm going to guess with being a financial executive, you probably should not be making rash decisions. And that would be a benefit, that you would want to make certain that somebody did have a fair amount of impulse control. And so when you start to, those are the 15 measures, and I utilize the assessment model provides, builds a number, and it's based on a statistical deviation. And when you get the report, it's a series of color-coded bar charts, which is one of the reasons I chose it when I was working with my project managers, who were mostly IT, very data focused, because they could understand color-coded bar charts. And what I like to do, I like to take it back to the normal curve. I'm sure many of you were overachievers in school. 100 doesn't mean 94 to 100 is an A, right? How many of you went to the mat to get your 97 pushed up to a 98 in high school? Anybody smiling? Yeah. Well, here 100 is average. If you get 100, and average is good, because remember, it's a matter of balance and the relationship between each of those 15 data points. So when I show you the real world scenarios, I just want you to see that 85 to 115 is average. The lower range is over here. You might even have a low to mid range. And over here, you have the high range. And also a quick point is, you may not necessarily getting down here to the 130, 145. It's talking about how engaged you are, not necessarily like that 99 or 100 being perfect. So think about self-perception. If you're scoring here around 145, that means that you are so busy paying attention to yourself that you have no time to pay attention to other people. What would you call that? Anybody? What would you call that behavior? You're so busy paying attention to yourself. Narcissism, right? Right, when you've got a narcissistic boss, are they looking to see what you need? Or are they just going to try to make themselves look good at your expense? Very likely. So let me get you into the real, my real world, how it applies to business, and the practical approach to emotional intelligence. So this is an engineer, Matt, not his real name, that I was working with. And he was a fabulous engineer. He still is a fabulous engineer. I'm still working with him. And he had just been promoted. It's a small company. The president's still very hands-on. The president and his direct supervisor, manager, saw his potential for leadership. They promoted him because they saw that potential. They brought me on board because, God bless him, Matt did not see his potential. And when we first gave him this assessment, I have all 15, so you can see the 15 traits. I only want you to look here. The A is for assertiveness. The SR is for self-regard. Our first sessions, he was so worried about asking a stupid question so that his manager would realize that he'd really made a mistake and demote him back to the engineer ranks. So we spent our first few sessions talking about how to ask the question so that Matt didn't feel that his boss would think the question is stupid. Now, we all know no question is stupid, but this young engineer was really worried about finding out that he was a fraud, imposter syndrome. I know we've all had that. So 5 months later, so you see 1027 to 320, our conversation changed. He was now being invited to executive meetings. The president, the other VPs were asking him questions when it related to his engineers and their function and, in the long-term strategic part of that. There was one VP who refused to speak with him. That VP would only speak to Matt's manager. And so our questions started being about, how did Matt get his voice heard at the table? How could he get this VP to speak with him? And I said, wow, we're having a different conversation. Let's reassess you. Look at that. His assertiveness jumped 52 points. It went from being one of his lowest scores to being one of his highest. His self-regard jumped 37 points. Is that amazing? And he did all the work. He really did the work. And some people might say, well, self-regard, he only, increased 32 points. How come not 52? Well, this is a snapshot of who you are in that moment. And he's a very humble person. And so what happens here, as I mentioned, if you get too far down in the engagement, you get so engaged, assertiveness can become aggression. And you can be very, very aggressive. Because his confidence, he was still over here in the medium to high range. His humility kept him from being aggressive. And he really was seen as a positive, growing leader in the company. And what you also can see is all of those 15 traits, he became more engaged and they pushed forward. So that, at that moment in time, he'd had significant growth. And this is where you could really measure it. I knew that he had done lots of growing. I knew we had different conversations. Now I know exactly what was going on, and I could measure his growth. Now, this is an individual. The power that you can also apply emotional intelligence to is within people in the business community. It can be department heads. I've been working with two business partners of a startup company. One business partner, Robert, according to Peter, makes decisions too quickly. And Robert thinks Peter makes decisions too slowly. So if you look over here, it's a startup. Robert is the entrepreneur, and names are changed. Robert is the entrepreneur who came up with the idea. His impulse control, I have to keep my finger off that. is impulse control. He doesn't have a whole lot of it, but he's an entrepreneur. He needs to be thinking of those great ideas. Guess what? Peter is in charge of operations. Peter needs to communicate to the staff. Peter gets to execute. Peter manages all the resources and the people. And so before Peter can make a decision, Peter needs to know that everybody involved will be positively impacted. So for their roles, business development strategies and operations, they're each very well suited. The question is, how do they work well together? So where it really came to a head is in a client meeting. Robert came up with a fabulous idea in the moment, said, yes, we can do it. Well, Peter was going, wait, because Peter knew it was going to be really hard to execute. In a prior meeting, Peter was getting really down in the weeds, how they would make this client's request happen. And Robert was like, whoa, we're going way too deep. They don't need to know that detail. And Robert was pretty ticked off. And so what we did when they realized and they could see what their personalities, they were just different people. Neither was bad. Both were well suited to their roles. But how could they work together? What they ended up doing was coming up with a keyword. It was a catchphrase that when one of them said it, we need to have, this requires, some sort of analysis. They were able to maybe have a sidebar, maybe take a break and say, this is a great idea. We need to get back to you with how we're going to execute that plan. Somehow they can save face for both parties. And the client won't really see that there's a major disagreement between their perspectives. And that really worked for them. When I checked back, I was told, well, we're working on it. We're getting there. So you're not going to take a pill and be perfect overnight, but it's a matter of observation and behaviors and the choices. Comments, questions? Here is an example of problem solving. Now, this is a restaurant, again, a startup. Angelo is the chef, their business partners. Sarah takes care of all of the communications, front office. Angela's got the back office. They were having an issue with how do you handle stress. And just like government IT subcontractors, restaurants, there is always something bad happening. The refreezer breaks, there's a pipe burst, two people don't show up for the shift, there's a huge increase in supply costs, lots of things. Well, Sarah had a very low stress tolerant level. In order to be resilient, to be able to problem solve, she needed to talk the problem through. If she couldn't talk the problem through and kind of get centered and understand the logic, her problem solving just spiraled out. The chef, big surprise, the chef's a problem solver. The chef just wants to dive in and fix it. Who needs to talk about it? The chef did not want to talk about it. In fact, it got to the point where the chef was hiding, physically hiding from Sarah. So we came together and they talked about it and they recognized where their conflict, the root cause of their conflict, and they came up with 3 sets of problems. One set, she was given access to an operational database. Another level, Sarah went to Angelo's assistant. And then the third level that required only Angelo's attention Then she could come. She had a code word that said, this is, a level problem. And Angela knew that at that point he had to stop and talk with her. But, having that 3-step process, she didn't run to talk every problem out with Angelo. And so she felt more comfortable. Her stress level, she was able to handle more stress because she knew there were people that she could speak with. Comments? Do you ever see people in your organizations or organizations that you work with that handle stress differently? Now, this is one of my favorite ones. This is, how do you get the right role? How do you get the right person in the right role? Because different roles require different skill sets. In this situation, we have Keiko, who is an amazing, amazing architect, really top-notch. And the reason Keiko is a top-notch architect is he has very strong impulse control. You don't want an architect making a rash decision. And Keiko's flexibility is pretty low. But in San Francisco, we have 2 buildings that are tilting because somebody said, 1 inch shouldn't matter too much. We can be a little bit flexible on those municipal requirements. And because they were just a little bit flexible, the outcome is in trouble. When you have people, how flexible do you need to be? Really flexible, right? Because everybody is different. And you need to be able to have some of those communication skills that you can speak with them and have those difficult conversations, like Raj was mentioning, that you may not always be able to give them what they want, but you're able to tell them why. No, I'm so sorry, you can't take that time off. 4 other people in the group have already requested time off. They may not like the outcome, but they understand where you're coming from. And they know the next time they have a vacation request, they get it in a lot earlier. But it's being able to back up those times when you can't be flexible with some pretty strong communication. And if you look over here, Keiko had pretty good emotional self-awareness. Keiko knew what she wanted and how she wanted the work to be done. The challenge here is Keiko had not had much experience communicating with other people. Her architectural work, she was so good, she didn't have to work with anybody else. And she's expected everybody to know as much as she did and to do the work exactly like she did. I'm sure none of you have ever done that, but have you known people that have done that? And so what would happen is, with that high level of impulse control, Keiko was afraid to say anything in any way negative because she knew you weren't supposed to say certain things. So she knew in her heart, she was like, "You fool, what are you doing? That's not right." She knew you weren't supposed to say that, so she didn't. And because the architects who were on that team, the junior architects, didn't know Keiko's expectations, they weren't able to do the work according to her high standards. So what would happen, because Keiko was too afraid of giving constructive feedback as they moved along, 2 or 3 days before the project was due, she'd check in. She would say, "This is terrible. Who taught you how to be an architect? How did you ever graduate?" Grab it back and fix it. So guess what those architects, those junior architects did? They resigned. They weren't respected. They weren't given good guidance, and they were blamed for work that they were left to their own devices, so they did the work like they thought they should do. So when 3 people left the firm and named Keiko as the reason they were leaving, the upper management realized that Keiko needed to take a step back and learn how to communicate a little bit differently. And so Keiko was not a bad person. Keiko just needed to learn how to communicate better, set expectations, and learn how to monitor. Recognize that they just didn't throw something over the transom to delegate, that Keiko needed to set expectations, provide some guidance, and keep a check on them. That she couldn't assume because she was fabulous at her job, everybody else would read her mind and be as fabulous as Keiko. Do you have any questions? So these examples are why I really feel that emotional intelligence can help business teams be more effective. And you can't just close your eyes and overnight make everything happen, change your behaviors, adjust your behaviors. But if you can start with one small goal, they're going to build on each other, just like Matt, where working on one piece, working on being more assertive, building his confidence, everything else in his performance moved forward. So there is truly a positive relationship and they all work together. So as business teams, you're going to be able to build those relationships by observing the situation and what's needed. You're going to be able to engage in trust because you're going to be gathering information, asking people's opinions, garnering their perspectives, and giving you a richer, more robust set of information to make decisions. And at the same time, really those observations are going to help you gain insight that as you engage people, as you bring them in, you're going to learn more about them. You're going to be able to maintain, and I hate the word soft skills, I really hate them, but you're going to be able to view their strengths and those areas where they're not strong. I hate to say weakness because everybody goes back and forth. I have a friend since junior high school who is a CPA and a project manager for one of the big 4 firms. I was on the board of our local Project Management Institute organization, and I had 20 different little budgets, and the different committees did not spend their money all at the same time. Now, I could have learned to have created a very cool spreadsheet. I knew Sandra could do it in 10 minutes. And I called her and I asked, do you need professional development units? She said, "Susan, what do you want me to do now?" I said, "We were friends since junior high school." And I told her I needed the spreadsheet. And she said, "Do I have to go to a meeting?" I said, "No, I just need the spreadsheet. If you give me the spreadsheet, I won't bother you again." So every month I let her know which groups had spent their budget. She added it to the spreadsheet, summed it up, and I gave it to our CFO, who thought I was fabulous because I gave him the information in the format that he wanted. And So it takes a balance. It's knowing where your strengths are and being able to count on other people. Either go to school. I could have learned how to make that spreadsheet thing, but I needed to also spend that time building those 20 groups, and I needed to add 2 more. So if I only have 2 hours of volunteer time, where's the best use of that time? So I called Sandra, and she got her credits, and she didn't have to go to a meeting. It was win-win. And so that's part of that emotional intelligence, is being aware of your vulnerabilities and finding those people who can work with you. And as I, mentioned before, taking the first steps, you can take it, leave here. What you want to do is pay attention to those people around you. Somebody even told me that they started at home, that their wife noticed that they were changing their behavior and appreciated the respect that they felt was being increased. So model that mutual respect. It costs absolutely nothing, right? It doesn't cost anything, and it takes a minimal amount of time. And then listen to understand. I know, we have active listening and appreciative listening are big buzzwords, but it's really listening and really listening. Ask the question and shut up. Let the other people speak. And I know it's so hard because I'm really bad. I get so excited. I want to cut them off and go, oh, that's so exciting. Can we do this? Can we do that? And I need to work on shutting up and letting them share their whole opinion. And so I know it's hard, but with these 3 steps that are just so simple, you can make a huge impact on your organization, whether it's your business, your client, could be your church group, your volunteer thing, your volunteer work with, this group. Yeah, it's all important. And so before we end, Bill, am I on time?
Yes, you are. It's time to wrap it up, but you're on
Which
time.
Is what I'm doing, is just review those prompts. When I talk about taking those first steps, these are 3 easy things to think about your intention. What do you want to have happen? So are you taking that time to think about what everybody else in the meeting cares about? Or are you only focused on what you need to get out, what you want to achieve? Are you listening to the real story? Or are you asking those probing questions? Our junior high school English teachers taught us about the 5 whys and how. And so I recommend that you're going to ask at least 4 or 5 questions to get to the real issue. And when you ask the questions, you do it where you're not accusing them. Let them know that you're being authentic and you really want to know the answer. And then lastly, include people. That's part of the respect. Get their buy-in and think about, and there are times where you are going to have to stand up and be the general and make a command decision. But if you're not in that urgent situation, are you making decisions for people, or are you including them so they have buy-in and they may even have a perspective or an idea that will save both time and budget? And that's what you get when you bring many people together. So I want to say thank you, Bill, for inviting me, letting me share my passion on my soapbox, that you really can take those intangible objects, those intangible leadership skills, and turn them into tactical, measurable results. So thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was very, very thorough discussion. Very, very thought-provoking. Anybody have any questions? I do realize it's time to go and we're losing people left and right here, but any Any final questions or thoughts before we go? No?
Susan,
Oh,
Susan,
Julie.
I'll say, I love the data, especially. You must have known I would love the data, but some of those stories hit very close to home. So you've given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for your attention. I was watching some body language and head nodding. So thank you for that. Raj, your question and your supplemental answer was spot on. Thank you very much.
Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question, Susan. That was a great presentation. I love the insights. Any thoughts on when you're trying to engage a team and you have people that are more introverted that are kind of afraid to, engage or afraid to speak up and get their help in order to get their buy-in?
Yeah. Sometimes it's helpful if you have a meeting before the meeting so that it's one-on-one and you can get their idea and you could bring it forward and you could say, Ron and I were speaking before this and Ron had a great idea. I'd like to share it. So Ron gets credit and confidence and knows that he's making a valuable contribution. Ron might then get the confidence and be assertive to step forward. The other comment is to have a call after the meeting because you might, sorry for picking on you, Ron, you might see Ron body language where he steps back, he starts to frown, he starts writing. Maybe, Ron even turns off his video because he's so ticked off. And it could be that he turned off the video because he had a crying kid. He had to go help, right? But to make that call to say, and this is where empathy comes in and paying attention to individuals. If you said, Ron, I noticed, you didn't look like you agreed with me, and that's okay. I like people to disagree with me. Could you share what concerns you? And that could be helpful. Thank you for the question. Karen?
Karen, you're on mute. Karen, you're on mute.
What I want to echo to it is doing consulting the last 2 or 3 years that I interact with a lot of customers and their finance team. I do recognize many points that Susan had brought up in the presentation. It's very helpful because that's how we connect with the customer, how we can actually make things happen, right? And one of the things I felt also very important is a recognition of the teams, their emotional intelligence as well. Because how we make a connection besides how we aware situation, but also thinking about our opponents, the team, the people we work with, what they are, so that we can look at how do we connect with them, what we need to, move forward or back off. I think that's very, very important as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon.